Why does everything look so grey lately? This is a McDonald's today, and this was one from the 90s. What felt like 10 years ago is now actually 30 years ago, and it shows the differences in the time periods. Today we live in an era of optimization. Everything is data-driven, brand-managed, and designed by an algorithm to be as inoffensive as possible. And in that process, we lost the soul of design. The 90s looked incredible, bright, cool, and alive. Not alive like a polished Instagram feed, but alive because nothing was optimized yet. Nothing was constrained by global guidelines, focus groups, or the minimalist police. Design in the 90s was bold because it wasn't trying to please everyone. It was experimental, expressive, and unapologetically human. From the games we played and the movies we watched to the cars we drove and the websites we built, everything had one thing in common: character. I still remember the Christmas of '96, jumping from a 16-bit Mega Drive to a 3D PlayStation wasn't just a technical leap, it felt like stepping into a bright future. And today we're going to unpack why the 90s looked so cool, and why the freedom of that decade gave rise to visuals that still resonate with us today. The 90s didn't just see in new consoles, it saw a leap in how games looked, felt, and were designed. We started the decade with the Super Nintendo, 16-bit graphics that were colourful, detailed, and expressive. Think Super Mario World or Street Fighter 2. These were technical marvels using clever sprite work to convey depth on a flat plane. Alongside the SNES, we had 8-bit systems lingering, mostly the NES and handhelds like the Game Boy. They were simpler, more abstract, but deeply influential. Pokemon Red, Yellow, and Blue would eventually define a whole generation. By the mid-90s, consoles like the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 redefined what was possible. Suddenly we moved from 2D landscapes to fully 3D worlds. As I mentioned before, I remember that Christmas of '96 so vividly. It was when I got my PlayStation, that jump from the Mega Drive really was unmatched. These were more than just polygons though, it changed gameplay, storytelling, and immersion. PS1's Final Fantasy VII gave players cinematic sequences that had never existed before. Tomb Raider introduced a female protagonist navigating three-dimensional architecture with groundbreaking camera angles. Even early 3D had its quirks: jagged polygons, low-res textures, and glitchy movement. But these weren't flaws, they were the visual language of experimentation. Developers were learning in real time what 3D could actually do. It gave games a unique aesthetic that just will never be replicated today. At one stage, you could only get advanced graphics in arcades. Whilst it was still more advanced, the rise of home consoles, PC gaming was pushing higher resolutions and 3D acceleration. PC games like Diablo, StarCraft, and Quake pushed experimentation even further. By the late 90s, we had 8-bit, 16, 32, and 64-bit graphics coexisting, giving the decade a layered experimental aesthetic. This meant the 90s wasn't just a decade of gaming, it was a visual evolution. And this technical leap shaped the entire aesthetic of our decade, from graphics to marketing and even the way kids imagine the future. The 90s cinematic world was bold. Filmmakers blended practical effects with emerging CGI to create stylized, immersive worlds. Jurassic Park's lifelike dinosaurs, Toy Story's fully 3D animation, and The Matrix's iconic green-tinged cyberpunk aesthetic were all about pushing boundaries. Some of the greatest movies ever made were in the 90s. Let's take Home Alone as an example. When was a film made like this in the last 25 years? Not just in terms of creative genius, but its distinct aesthetic. The colours, the storytelling, the actual way that it was filmed. It had texture, charm, and a visual identity that you just don't see anymore. And even smaller films leaned into design. Teen movies, comedies, and action flicks used bold colour palettes and playful set design. 10 Things I Hate About You and American Pie turned bedrooms, schools, malls, and arcades into stages for visual storytelling and often hyper-stylized to evoke energy. Watching a film in the cinema was a real experience. I remember watching Flubber, Lion King, and The Mask as some of my first movies, and I was mesmerised. And then 12 months later, you eventually bought the VHS tapes, and the slightly grainy aesthetic just added to the charm. Special effects weren't just technical, they were expressive tools. The 90s were the golden age of experiential branding. Fast food wasn't just a meal, it was a curated event. Stepping into McDonald's in 1995 didn't just feel like entering a sterile corporate office, it felt like a high-energy playground. The physical spaces were a masterclass in sensory design. We had the play place, a miniature world of primary colour tunnels and ball pits. Inside, the interiors used a palette of hyper-saturated reds and yellows specifically designed to trigger energy and appetite. From the character-themed chairs to the game stations, every square inch was about total immersion. Even the Happy Meal toys weren't just plastic, they were cultural events. Toy Story, Jurassic Park, Beanie Babies, Yo-Yos, Hercules, you didn't just eat, you lived in that brand's universe for 45 minutes. And Pizza Hut carried a similar weight. Friday nights were a ritual defined by red roof architecture and glowing neon signs. Inside, it was a tactile heaven. Checkered tablecloths, the smell of grease, and the distinct click of arcade machines. This was the era of the bucket program, a brilliant psychological hook that turned reading books into free pizza, cementing brand loyalty before we even hit puberty. They had great character partnerships with Casper, Beauty and the Beast, and Land Before Time. Today, these chains have franchised into efficiency-focused voids, designed for delivery and high turnover, and stripping away the visual excitement once made them icons. But the real battlefield for brands was on the TV screen. 90s advertising wasn't something you skipped unless you needed a toilet in between your TV program where you try and sprint back right before it started. Saturday morning cartoons weren't just shows, they were delivery systems for a masterclass in kinetic marketing. Advertising in the 90s used a visual language of extreme pacing. Think of the Game Genie advert. It was chaos, fast-paced, and used a jagged, extreme editing style that mirrored the rebellious energy of the decade. We had the surrealism of McDonald's Mac Tonight, a moon-headed lounge singer that felt more like a short film than a burger ad. And we had the What's Up Budweiser advert that transcended our entire generation. These weren't just commercials, they were micro-stories. Whether it's the over-the-top slime-filled aesthetics of Nickelodeon promos, or the theatrical energy of the cereal ads, the goal wasn't just to sell a product, it was to own your attention. They used bold primary palettes and playful distorted typography as strategic visual cues. They knew that the world without a skip button had to reward your gaze. Brands were immersive, theatrical, turning a 30-second spot into a small, unforgettable spectacle. We weren't just consumers, we were the audience. The ultimate icon of this shift was the iMac G3. By releasing a computer in Bondi Blue, Tangerine, and Blueberry, Apple made a radical statement that technology could be fun. It used translucent polycarbonate plastics to demystify the machine, turning a workspace tool into a cultural centerpiece. This translucent trend trickled down into everything, from Game Boy Colors to Pages, revealing the internal circuitry as if to say, the future is transparent. And I genuinely believe this will be the future of hardware. How wrong was I? Gaming hardware did follow the same path. While the PS1 brought a sleek industrial grade that made 3D gaming feel grown up, Nintendo and Sega leaned into fluorescent candy-coloured aesthetics. Even the controllers weren't shy. Transparent shells and quirky ergonomic designs turned interacting with a console into a sensory experience. Portable media players were the final cornerstone. The Sony Discman and Walkman didn't just play music, they transformed it into a mobile performance. These devices were engineered with metallic finishes and oversized physical buttons. You didn't just click a song on a screen, you felt the mechanical click of the lid, the weight of the disc spinning, and the tactile feedback of a physical volume wheel. Even headphones came in neon green and hot pink, reinforcing a playful, individualized identity. From the Virtual Boy's bold and failed attempt at VR to the Talk Boy's physical hardware hack, every color choice and every oversized button was intentional. They were designed to excite, to signal that technology was finally aspirational. These weren't just tools, they were iconic design objects that proved tech could have a personality. Even today, the sheer joy of interacting with a 90s gadget is a reminder of a decade that chose expression over efficiency. The 90s internet was not sleek, and it definitely wasn't corporate. It certainly wasn't designed to optimize for time on page or conversion funnels. It was a massive, creative Wild West. Early web platforms like GeoCities, Angelfire, and Tripod gave users something that we've almost entirely lost today: digital sovereignty. You didn't just fill out a profile template, you designed a world. Each neon background, low-res animated GIF, and scrolling marquee text reflected the raw personality and humor of its creator, not the cold logic of an algorithm. This was the era of Web 1.0, where the visual language was built on HTML templates and frames. This created a rigid modular setting that users filled with visual noise. You had to hit count at the bottom, tracking every visitor like a badge of honor. Guest books for friends to leave a digital footprint, and autoplay MIDI songs that hit you the moment the page landed. These weren't bad design choices, they were expressions of freedom. In a world before A/B testing and SEO dominance, the 90s was human first and performance second. Some corners of this era do remain frozen in time, offering a glimpse of the aesthetic in its purest form. Take Space Jam. This hasn't changed since 1996. With storytile background, looping character gifs, and navigation menu that feels completely alien to modern UX sensibilities, it remains a masterpiece of 90s optimism. Even the corporate giants at the time, from Nickelodeon to early gaming portals like IGN, embraced the chaos. The chaos wasn't a mistake, the chaos was the point. By the late 90s, a very specific type of wacky postmodernism had steeped into the DNA of the decade. This wasn't just style for style's sakes, it was playfulness as a philosophy. It was a revolt against mid-century rules of form follows function, where everything had to be neat, serious, and predictable. Designers and brands embraced exaggerated proportions. Memphis-inspired geometry and clashing palettes. Polka dot spirals, slime textures, checkerboard patterns, and neon gradients weren't just accidents. They were deliberate disruptions meant to grab attention in an increasingly crowded media landscape. You saw it everywhere. The squiggles on a Nickelodeon device, the tubular primary colored furniture in arcades, the fluorescent signage in fast food play places, and the strange asymmetrical chairs in your bedroom. Typography went rogue too. Clean serifs gave way to distressed and liquid fonts, dripped or bouncing across cereal boxes, VHS covers, and TV idents. Every logo, font, and visual element became a small act of defiance against minimalization and efficiency. But by the early to mid-2000s, the era of unconstrained improvisation hit a wall. Intuition-led design gave way to data-driven templates. Algorithms dictated layouts, minimalism replaced neon chaos, and efficiency replaced wonder. The Wacky Postmodern program was traded for a minimalist void, easier to navigate but far harder to remember and almost impossible to feel. The 90s aesthetic endures because it dared to experiment. Every curve, every colour clash, and every slime screen squiggle wasn't a mistake. It was a tiny act of freedom. And maybe that's why, even decades later, we don't just feel nostalgic for the 90s, we admire its audacity. The 90s were a decade of radical automotive rebirth. We witnessed the total death of the sharp, angular, folded paper designs of the 80s, and cars didn't just become rounder, they became biological. This wasn't a fashion trend, it was the birth of the computer-aided design as a dominant force in the industry. For the very first time, engineers could model airflow, refine drag coefficients, and simulate structural performance digitally before a single clay prototype was ever scraped. This shifted the entire philosophy of car manufacturing from guesswork to precision engineering. You could see this biodesign revolution across the board. Look at the Honda NSX, a car designed with a cockpit inspired by the F-16 fighter jet, offering unparalleled visibility and an aerodynamic profile that made Ferraris look archaic. We saw the McLaren F1, which used a gold leaf-lined engine bay for heat reflection, and the Dodge Viper, which was a brutal curved masterpiece of V10 muscle meets modern styling. Even the JDM icons, the Subaru WRX and the Nissan Skyline GTR R34 showcased a mix of sleek dynamic curves and performance-focused aggression that was engineered for the wind tunnel. But this wasn't just reserved for elite supercars. The curvature revolution trickled down into driveways of everyday people. The Honda Civic evolved from a boxy 80s commuter into a fluid, rounded shape that felt like it was moving while it was standing still. These cars were lighter, faster, and more structurally rigid because CAD allowed for precise manufacturing tolerances that humans simply couldn't achieve by hand in previous decades. The marketing in the 90s leading into this new aesthetic with hyper-stylized lens. Cars weren't just photographed on showroom floors, they were bathed in saturated sunsets, placed beside mirror-like lakes, or filmed on winding coastal roads to highlight the play of light over those complex new reflections. It was a visual promise that technology was finally catching up to our imaginations. The 90s wasn't just about cars that looked cool. These were technological marvels that married engineering innovation and unapologetic, bold design language that we've almost entirely lost in today's era of generic, safe SUVs. So I imagine you're sat here watching this now thinking, why did this all stop? Why did we trade the colour and the 3D experimentation for the minimalist void of today? The short answer is for efficiency. As the internet matured and global corporations grew, designs became a science rather than an art. We entered the era of A/B testing and frictionless user experiences, attempting to put customers at the heart of the journey, yet failing to understand what that actually meant. Bold colours were replaced by safe neutrals that wouldn't offend the global audience, and unique architectural quirks were ironed out to make buildings easier to clean and cheaper to maintain. We optimised the joy right out of the room. But there's a reason 90s aesthetics are exploding on the internet right now. Whether it's the revival of low-poly PS1 style horror games, or the obsession with Fruitiger Aero and the Global Village coffeehouse visuals, we are collectively hitting a breaking point with minimalism. We're starting to realise that a world designed by data is efficient, but it's so boring. The 90s looked cool because it was a decade that just dared to be different. It was the last era where the human touch was more important than an algorithm. Maybe it's time we stop making everything look clean and start making it look alive again. I don't know about you, but I'd trade 1,000 modern minimalist cafes for a 1996 pizza with a glowing neon sign and sit-down arcade in a heartbeat. If you remember that feeling, or you just wish you'd been there to see it, drop a comment below. What's the one 90s aesthetic that you'd wish you could bring back? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.